Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this Optiv and Cylance webinar entitled A Radical Approach to Risk Management. I will be your host, Laura Groff. I'm from the Partner Management team here at Optiv. I would like to introduce our speakers. We are honored to be joined today by experts from both Optiv and our valued strategic partner, Cylance. First off, Woodrow Brown is the Director of Partner Research from Optiv. Woodrow has over a decade of leadership, service delivery, and research experience. We also have Malcolm Harkins joining us. Malcolm is the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance. Malcolm reports to the CEO and is responsible for enabling business growth through trusted infrastructure, systems, and business processes. He has direct organizational responsibility for information risk, security, and privacy policy. Wanted to let you know that all questions can be submitted throughout the webinar and will be consolidated to be answered once the presentation concludes, or via email from Optiv and Cylance. To kick things off, I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm.
Thanks, Laura. For anybody who's heard me talk before, you know I like to tell stories. And the first story that I want to explain to folks, because I think it adds some relevant context and perspective when we think about cyber risk and the approach to controls that we need to take, is one that I call prevention in Panama. And many people know of the Panama Canal and know of some of the stories on it, but if you look back historically, there were struggles with the Panama Canal. And for decades and decades and decades, many countries failed to create it. And so in the late 1800s, the French started building the Panama Canal. They had had success in building the Suez Canal a few years earlier, and they thought that if they took the learnings that they had from the Suez Canal and applied it in Panama, they'd be successful in creating the Panama Canal, but that wasn't the case. And there was a couple issues for this. One was the Suez Canal was constructed at sea level, and they attempted to do the same thing in Panama. And with a few hundred inches of rain annually, it washed away much of the work. So you could, relatively speaking, consider this an architectural failure. But there was another element to the construction of the Panama Canal that also held back the potential progress. And that was mosquito-borne diseases, malaria. And what was happening during the attempts to construct the Panama Canal was tens of thousands of workers were dying annually. And those that didn't die were given quinine to help them recover. The problem with quinine, though, it was toxic to the people who took it by and large. And it left many of the workers deaf. So imagine if you didn't die from malaria, and you're given a control to make you better, and you end up deaf, and then you go back to digging ditches. How safe would that be? And so there was some fundamental issues, not only again with the architecture, but the control design that was an impediment to the construction of the Panama Canal. Now, if you fast forward a little bit further in time, in 1903, Panama declares itself a country, and U.S. Gains construction rights to the Panama Canal. And then the Panama Canal Zone gets formed, work begins a few years later, and then in just a 4-year time span, the Panama Canal was constructed. And so you have to go back and say, well, what changed? Well, first of all, when the U.S. took over the Panama Canal Zone, it changed, again, the architecture. It moved up into the mountains, hence the lock system. So that was one fundamental change that allowed for the Panama Canal to get built. But the other fundamental, again, limiting factor was malaria. And what ended up happening was Major Ronald Ross discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes. And so the control of malaria was vital for the construction of the Panama Canal. Without it, you wouldn't have had the workforce to actually complete the manual labor and construction. But once Major Ronald Ross discovered that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes, Colonel Gorges came in and they formed a sanitary department for the Canal Zone. And what ended up happening was transformational, because what they did is they understood the root cause of the problem. They understood through the research where mosquitoes would breed and how they would move, and they went about an appropriate control program to limit the amount of mosquitoes. And the results of this are pretty staggering. They eradicated yellow fever, by and large, in the country. The death rate of workers dropped by almost tenfold in a 3-year period, and the death rate for the entire population of Panama dropped by almost eightfold from mosquito-borne disease. And when I step back and think about this, again, relative to cybersecurity and information technology, I find by and large that, again, we have these limiting factors that we haven't gotten to the root cause of the problems and solved them at the heart of the problem in an effective and efficient fashion. And so therefore, we've kind of held ourselves back, and we continue to have the cyber cycle. Now, what ended up happening when you look at solving these problems and getting to the root cause and preempting the entire cycle from the beginning is it unleashed economic efficiency for the world once the Panama Canal construction got done. And again, this was only made possible by the appropriate control of what was causing the issues. I'm going to hand it over to Woodrow, and we'll go through a little bit more of the story here as we progress through the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Malcolm. That was definitely an interesting historical perspective on a pretty big challenge that they were facing. Today, many of us are working to face an equally great challenge. These cyber criminals essentially are economic parasites that are extracting value from our organizations. Much like the parasitic protozoans, these malaria that was infecting hosts, cyber criminals are moving in and infecting our endpoint systems. And endpoints are going to remain targets for some time for the foreseeable future. Looking for those root causes, right, we can think about some of the commonalities around the endpoint as a host and the human host. Much like the human genome, endpoints have commonalities, common OSs, common browsers, common office suites that cyber criminals are preying on because of the vulnerabilities that are increasing over time within the code base of the software that's being written. Common OSs, common browsers, and common office utility suites with ever-increasing code bases are just laying these breeding grounds for cyber criminals to take action and extract value from their hosts. Secondarily, you have commonalities within human emotions, fear, greed, urgency, curiosity. These are also being played upon largely right at the endpoint when users get some type of email, some type of phishing scheme arises. It looks too good to click on, right? So these are some of the things that, we are combating every day to helpfully eradicate cyber criminals. Thinking about efficiency and some of the drags on efficiency, this has become an interesting theme at Optiv here is how can we increase the efficiency and get marginal gains out of the security program, helping organizations move faster and be more agile. A lot of this boils down to a couple of different things. Industry noise, the continual need to swap out your different security products, as well as even coming down to determining should you be performing in-house efficacy testing. In my role at Optiv, I look at a lot of different products day in and day out. Some of them are, pretty new and innovative. Some, it's really hard to tell what they actually do, even if you get down to the website, the marketing information. You can categorize them, but when you throw a few use cases out, you can't really determine if that solution is going to be truly effective against the use cases that you're trying to solve for. So what do? We spend a lot of time putting these solutions through their paces in lab-based environments, executing against use cases that we feel reflect real-world situations that our clients are dealing with every day, to try to understand, what are the actual successful outcomes you can achieve? What's only a feature? Where is the true product set? Also, in speaking with clients that are really interested in, maturing their security program, it's not only the technology component, but the process component. Looking at swapping out different solutions, year in and year out, is it a function of due diligence, or is it potentially a waste of time? Looking at the explicit costs and implicit costs of doing these swap outs. The explicit costs, pretty readable and easy to calculate. But when you think about some of the implicit costs, the loss of focus on improvement in the current working environment, duplication of your team's research efforts that have already been performed by others, resetting the operational aspects of utilizing the platform that you have in place for a new platform, retooling. These are some of the implicit costs that we think clients should take in consideration and perhaps have a drag on efficiency. Much like quinine was not the solution, sometimes doing POCs for efficacy testing is not the solution either. We've seen flawed methodologies taking place, solely focused on running through multiple file types, determining if file type A versus B versus C will get through some type of defensive system. Keying in on only one aspect of the kill chain or one subcategory of the MITRE ATT&CK framework instead of looking at a holistic perspective. Doing things such as testing with samples that were not blocked in the past, determining if some net new solution will block these today. Just a couple of things to think about as you're working on tooling your information security program. And I will pass it back to Malcolm.
Thanks, Woodrow. And again, thinking back to the Panama Canal and thinking back to the, in essence, economic boom that occurred at the turn of the century, partly because of the success of the Panama Canal and the efficiency that led to the world. I grew up at Intel. I spent 24 years there before I came to Cylance, and so grew up in the heart of the computing industry. So I've long believed that computing has the potential to connect and enrich lives and create social and economic benefit. And I think by and large today, the cyber risk cycle that we're seeing is limiting the potential for computing to unleash social and economic benefit. And I think if the cyber risk cycle continues as it appears to be, again, we could constrain what's possible. And so when you think of this again relative to the Panama Canal story, the lessons for security in this is, malaria wasn't eliminated. Risk cannot be eliminated. You can prevent a heck of a lot of it. And we can do a way better job of preventing the risk cycles that we're seeing today. But you have to identify the root cause of the problems and go after them in the appropriate fashion. And when you do that, again, you can properly control for the risk without a level of toxicity. And I would venture to say that a lot of the security controls and approaches that we have in organizations today are toxic to the user experience, toxic to the business philosophy that the business wants us to achieve. Now, when I wrote my second book on managing risk and information security, as I was leaving Intel, I had stepped back because I had honestly gotten frustrated with the security industry and its motivations, its marketing methodologies, and the confusion and chaos it creates in many cases, with how we approach it and how we message things. And I stepped back and I said, we've got to think about risk a little bit more fundamentally and get back to basics. There's three primary ways you can control for risk. You can prevent it, you can detect it, you can respond to it. And as you go from prevention to response, risk grows. And then there's three primary approaches to control for risk. Again, they could be physical risk, logical risk. You can do it in an automated fashion, semi-automated, and manual. And when you go from automated to manual, cost grows. But by and large, most organizations are stuck in this semi-automated to manual detection and response. And being a bit of a cynic and a former finance guy, you go, well, why is that? Why are we stuck in this semi-automated to manual cycle? And being a bit of a cynic, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. If it's the highest cost to us as organizations, it's the highest revenue growth for the industry. And so you've got to start wondering, is that where the industry wants us to be? Because that's where the industry makes it the most money, rather than going about systemically understanding the root cause of the problems and appropriately addressing them. Because as a organization, if I'm a CISO, my job is to have the lowest risk at the lowest cost with the least amount of liability. But there's a third dimension to what I call this 9-box. And the third dimension is control friction, because again, controls are drag coefficient on people, data, business processes. Again, a level of almost toxicity to the computing experience. And in a high control friction environment, what ends up happening? Your users and your business go around the control. You think you've controlled for the risk only to have it be unmanaged, unmitigated, and by and large, you don't know that it's occurring. And so why do we have such a degree of control friction? Well, by and large, CISOs aren't managed necessarily on the control friction. You might hear the moaning and groaning from the business on it, but you're not held accountable to it. And the security industry itself, again, I don't think has much of an economic incentive to solve the control friction, because if there's friction on the controls that get implemented and your user and business goes around you, that generates risks, which then the security industry will be there to try and sell you another solution to mitigate the risk that they created because of the toxicity of their solution on your computing environment. So again, think back about these things and think about it from an economic perspective. How do I achieve economic efficiency, not only in my approach to controls, but how my controls affect the economic efficiency of my business? Woodrow, back to you.
Thanks, Malcolm. So when thinking about operational efficiencies that organizations can seek, we are coaching right now a couple of different themes. One is automation. Two is, seeking prevention first. And three is working towards moving to that lower left corner, right? The lowest risk and lowest cost operational state. So for automation, I think it's very important wherever possible to move security controls from a manual state into an automated state to the best degree you can. Taking some of that energy, taking some of those implicit costs from chasing industry noise and refocus that on process maturity. What actions are being performed on a daily basis, an hourly basis within an organization that can be minimized to seconds using integration, automation, and tools that seek prevention first. The response often seeks to treat or remedy the symptoms and not the cause. So really keying in on that prevent first and then utilizing the saved manpower, the saved hours to do higher level tasks, working on that process maturity for the organization overall. Optiv is a security solution integrator with a very simple goal: maximize and communicate the effectiveness of your security program. And much of the maximization of the security program is done by helping you gain and locate where you can introduce these additional efficiencies within the program to ensure it's functioning to its maximum degree. Optiv has a wide portfolio of solutions, of course including endpoint integration and management with Cylance. We also have security program effectiveness as well as operational options. We can assist with your regulatory compliance and help you work on your strategy and tool optimization. Specifically with Cylance, Optiv has rolled out programs that allow us to install and configure the solution as well as manage it. Our MSS team has offerings for monitoring as well as a focused monitoring solution around managed endpoint EDR. Laura, I will turn it back to you to see if we have questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. The first question we have is, do you recommend having EDR in your organization when you have solid protection in place?
Do I'm going to start with that, Woodrow?
Sure. We do an annual endpoint testing exercise every year, and it's always interesting to look at some of the outcomes that we get out of that. The endpoint space, like I said earlier, remains kind of a contentious ground, and folks are always asking us questions and comparing and contrasting the different solutions. I think EDR is important, and obviously Cylance has released optics to focus in on that space. However, like we introduced in this topic area, if you prevent first and nullify the threat, you're not spending that additional time cycles trying to find out what happened, where did it go, and what else has been affected. But not all solutions are perfect, and sometimes threats get through, and that is where we think there is certainly a valid play for EDR to be able to drill down and determine, what else was infected in my environment, where did the threat move, is it still present, and how can I better defend upon it in the future?
Yeah, and to just add on to that, I do think, much like my 9-box, you need the right level of prevention, but you always need detection and response because, again, you can't eliminate all aspects of risk. And so, again, you have to think about it from your control philosophy and control strategy with a prevention-first focused effort. But we've seen from many of our customers and many of my peers that I'm friends with who've become customers, we all have, by and large, perhaps a security operations center and some level of detection and response capabilities. And they might be, again, ranging from automated to semi-manual. But what we found is with the deployment of Cylance and the efficacy of control that we have with a low degree of control friction, no additional investments in detection and response, and people get better detection and response. Because if I've shut down all the whack-a-mole issues that I'm playing with malware, I've reduced the alert fatigue on my security operations center because you've quieted down the environment. If you have a quieter environment, your ability to detect something astray improves dramatically. And so you have to think about the fact that you might not need to invest entirely in new detection and response capabilities, but better prevention will lead to better detection and response. And I've seen that be the case with many of our customers.
Our next question is, will you describe how automated silence really is and how much hands-on it requires?
Yeah, so once you roll out the product, most of our typical customer rollouts over the course of the first few weeks, they'll get the deployment going and have it in essence, alert mode so that they can get it installed. And then, honestly, with that alert mode, they'll be able to find malicious code that is either dormant or been undetected or unmitigated from other solutions they've had in their environment. And then you can go through the process of putting the product into auto quarantine, turning on memory protection, script control, and do that eradication. But going into alert mode allows you to understand the environment, understand where you have threat actors and threat agents in your environment today, and then go through the appropriate investigation as well as eradication cycle to, in essence, put yourself in what we call a threat zero position through the product rollout. And then once you're done with that, it's honestly like with anything, there's a little bit of care and feeding because environments are changing. You're adding PCs and laptops and servers. You're making changes in the environment. You might need to adjust your policy settings, and you might want to, when you roll it out, zone your environment for a high critical environment with a higher level of potential control so you can monitor it differently, and general environment. But once it's installed, what we found, because our back-end capability, the console where you manage the policies, is in the cloud, we see with a lot of customers where with a traditional solution, they may have 5, 6, 7 security engineers doing the care and feeding of traditional AV and managing DATs and definitions and infrastructure and all that. And we've seen from many customers that are in that type of situation that they're able to in essence, reallocate a good portion of that security engineering team to other higher priority tasks and, in essence, get a real business return because of the efficiency and the effectiveness and the streamlining that the capability has that doesn't require an army of security engineers managing the infrastructure.
Malcolm, I think that's a key phrase there, streamlined. It is an extremely efficient endpoint security solution. We've rolled out dozens of different platforms in the past, and Cylance is always one of the fastest to roll out, set up, and configure. There's definitely some care and feeding needed, as always, tailoring the solution per your environment. But I think organizations will find efficiencies within the platform itself due to the design, the low infrastructure management that's required on-prem, and the ability to kind of move pretty quickly and effectively to get the solution rolled out and configured and in a state where it's fully operational.
Yeah, we've had some customers, in fact, one of our larger customers in their first wave of deploying us a few years ago, deployed out well over 100,000 endpoints in under 3 weeks with no help desk calls. No complaints from the end user and no disruption.
Great. So one more question is, would you please elaborate on control friction in an environment where you have several different applications protecting the endpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, as I mentioned, control friction, again, it's a drag coefficient, right? It slows down people, data, business processes, chews up unnecessary compute cycles. Now, when you look at perhaps the stack or layers that people keep adding to a laptop or a server, it chews up CPU and memory cycles. And by and large, traditional AV is completely inefficient, not only from a ineffective, but it's inefficient in how it operates because it's constantly chatting with the cloud, asking for instructions, sending data back and forth, needing to do scans constantly and all that stuff. So when you have solutions like that, or multiple endpoint agents that in some cases are all heavyweight, you're adding a weight to the computing experience. You're again shortening the life cycle of the compute asset because it's inefficient, as well as you've perhaps added complexity to what your IT team has to deal with if you've got multiple agents. That's why Silence has been designed without having to have that cloud dependency for the efficacy of control. It's been designed so that it's a lightweight agent, 40, 50 megabytes, and the kernel level shim that prior to the execution of code, we do mathematical calculation in milliseconds to determine good from bad. We've designed it to be, quote unquote, silent to the user experience and silent to the computing paradigm to reduce that control friction and that drag coefficient on the computer and on the user.
Taking a slightly different spin on that and kind of bringing this back to the point of automation and seeking, where possible, to automate security controls in the environment. We recently did a project where we took a bunch of ad hoc and manual procedures and we looked at how we can streamline this and how we can codify those workflows. And choices had to be made. We have several different security controls we could choose from to perform these exercises. But when you get to the point of kind of codifying these items of your workflow, moving those manual ad hoc procedures to more streamlined and automated procedures, you have to choose, where are you going to ingest from? Who's going to give you the alert? Where are you going to take action? And you might have tools and controls that overlap in your environment, but at some point, you're going to have to make a choice with which one's going to do the work. So I think, just reducing the complexity, getting to a simpler, more streamlined environment is really important for security organizations.
Awesome. Thank you, Woodrow and Malcolm, and thank you everyone for joining. That concludes our webinar today. We hope you enjoyed the presentations. A follow-up email will be sent to you guys directly, which will include links to review today's webinar recording, download the assets, and retrieve contact info should you have any follow-up questions. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.